What is going on, everyone? I am Cucumber, and today I thought I would share with you guys some various interesting things I found concerning clerics, their purpose, and overall the Way of White itself. This video will be a little different from what I have previously made, so I hope everything comes together well enough. Also, I would like to make it known that many, if not most, of my theories or guesses that I make throughout the video may very well be wrong. Like I said, they're theories and guesses, nothing more than that. I digress. Let's continue with the video. Recently, I've been playing Dark Souls 3 again for some footage when I stumbled into the Cathedral of the Deep, or at least the bonfire right after the Crystal Sage. It was then when I once again picked up the Paladin's Ashes item. However, the difference with this instance was that I decided to read the item description, as I have never heard of the Paladin class ever being referenced in Dark Souls. There was the Cleric and the Herald, but never a Paladin. Let's take a look at its description. Umbral Ash of a worn-out Paladin who sought the Cathedral of the Deep. This paladin paid quite the price for his headstrong justice. As interesting and vague as that may be, I initially thought that my curiosity would end there. That was not the case, as this item was the catalyst to a very deep rabbit hole. If you take a second look at the actual item itself, you'll notice that the hand of the fallen paladin is clutching something in its ashen fingers. I recognize the trinket as an undead hunter charm, or as it was previously known, a Lloyd's talisman. Let's get a more complete picture of this item's purpose by reading both descriptions, starting with the charm. Used long ago by Allfather Lloyd's cleric knights on their undead hunts. Although Allfather Lloyd is long forgotten by the Way of White, his hunts have lived on, and this charm allows one to challenge the undead without fear of tenacious healing. Now for the talisman. In the outside world, the undead are accursed creatures, and Lloyd's cleric knights are widely praised for their undead hunts. This blessed talisman blocks undead recovery, allowing the knights to fight with impunity. A little more has been shown to us about the story of our paladin friend. This allows us to conclude that perhaps he was on his way to an undead hunt, which possibly alludes to his headstrong justice that resulted in the paladin's death. The things that caught my attention was how both descriptions referenced Allfather Lloyd, who we will go over in a bit, and more importantly for our situation right now, cleric knights. This made me wonder, was this possibly a translation error that caused cleric knights and paladins to be almost interchangeable, or was there in fact a difference? To answer that, I went around my inventory and searched throughout all the different weapons, rings, miracles, and whatever else that made references to clerics, cleric knights, and paladins. Overall, the TLDR of what I found was that, yes, cleric knights are different from paladins. How about we get into the nitty-gritty of what I found? There are a few items in Dark Souls 3 that immediately caught my attention when I tried to find out the difference between paladins and cleric knights. Two of them specifically are the Magic Barrier Miracle and the Braille Divine Tome of Lothric, as their descriptions, I believe, allude to there being differences between the two classes. The Magic Barrier Miracle reads, Miracle of clerics who wield weapons. There is a short period in history where clerics and sorcerers opposed one another. Thus, it became necessary for even simple clerics to have some means of opposing magic. For the Braille Divine Tome of Lothric, a sacred Braille tome from Lothric, filled with miracles for use by knights. It is said that no paladin inside Lothric Castle could fall, owing to the divine protection they enjoy. Okay, with what we have here, the Magic Barrier Miracle makes a distinction between certain types of clerics, as it states that this miracle is meant for those who wield weapons. That means, of course, there are those who do not use weapons, perhaps normal clerics. The distinction there is what tells me that this miracle, at least initially, was meant for cleric knights, for those who apparently used weapons. Addressing the Divine Tome, it may seem as if that the description, whenever it points out knights, it's possibly just abbreviating cleric knights. The tome itself even teaches the Magic Barrier Miracle if given to Irina. However, it goes on to describe how the paladins of Lothric could not fall, owing to the divine protection they, quote-unquote, enjoyed. The wording behind this description really gets to me, because for one, many other item descriptions do not abbreviate cleric knights, such as the Replenishment Miracle from Dark Souls 3, which states, a miracle once cherished by cleric knights. Replenishment is a relic of the old Lloyd faith, whose cleric knights were unfaltering in battle. This one description uses cleric knights twice, If anything, this instance would be the perfect opportunity to use an abbreviation, as we would know that the possible use of knight alludes to cleric knights, as previously stated in the same description. Secondly, the word enjoyed also caught my attention. I may be reading into this a little too much, but from the way I see it, the description almost insinuates that the paladins who enjoy this divine protection did not always have it like a normal cleric or even cleric knight who most likely grew up around this level of faith and protection did. While the paladins themselves had faith, they did not know how to utilize it to execute these miracles. So this evidence leads me to believe that the knights that the Braille Divine Tome of Lothric reference are actual knights, the Lothric Knights. The idea that they're actual straight-up knights that were taught these miracles goes even further, as in Dark Souls 1, clerics and knights are the only two classes that begin the game within the Way of White Covenant. These knights were well prepared with staunch enough faith to learn these miracles, especially ones from Lothric, whose royal family was destined, was bred to link the fire. Coincidentally, the Way of White, the faith which clerics hold, follows and even worships Gwyn, who first linked the fire. Therefore, I do believe that there is a difference between paladins and cleric knights. From what I've seen and shown you guys, I deduced, and I very well may be incorrect, that paladins are knights who learned miracles, while cleric knights are clerics who learned how to wield weapons. Alright, that does it with this section. I've only just scratched the surface, as I learned a lot when it comes to the Way of White and its dark history. How about we delve into that a little bit more? When I was researching the Way of White, clerics and the like, I very quickly came upon the item descriptions of the cleric set in Dark Souls 3, which provided a sizable chunk of vague insight. The cleric hat reads, "Hat worn by a cleric turned undead. Typical attire for blue-robed travelers. It is said that they are entrusted with a duty. Still, its nature is yet to be revealed." The rest of the set also describes how undead clerics are entrusted with a duty. The next question that came up for me was, what is this supposed duty? What is the purpose of clerics? It was then when I remembered reading something about a duty on another class's gear, the Herald. The Herald helm states, "Steel helm said to be worn by heralds of the Way of White, who deliver commandments of duty." I immediately made the connection between the two, and assumed now that the herald's purpose was most likely dictated to deliver these commandments of duty to the newly undead clerics, who would then fulfill this unknown duty. Now I'm even more curious. What is this duty? To answer this, I went over to Dark Souls 1 to see if I can find some more insight. Firstly, I went to the cleric set and unfortunately did not learn much from its description, as it did not mention a duty. However, looking through some miracles in Dark Souls 1, I found Seek Guidance, which says that it is a miracle of clerics on an undead mission. An undead mission? Perhaps this was the duty clerics have been assigned. I looked into it more and found some dialogue from Petrus of Thorland, the cleric that introduces you to the Way of White in the beginning of Dark Souls 1.
"My companions are Milady and her young knights. She is young, but burdened by an undead mission. We are her defenses, to keep her from harm." "An undead mission? Regrettably, I cannot share that with you. But you are my pupil. Perhaps if you show your faith." "Very well. I can surely tell you, of all people, undead clerics are given a mission to seek kindling. Kindling is the art of feeding bonfires with humanity. Through kindling, we shall one day be granted magnificent powers."
Now we know that, at least in Dark Souls 1, that it was an undead cleric's mission to find the rite of kindling, so that he could empower the bonfires, which I later learned helped abate the Age of Dark, at least a little bit. How does this connect to the duty clerics now have in Dark Souls 3? With what we have so far, it does not appear that the undead mission and the duty are one and the same, because why would the cleric's duty be described as one yet to be revealed if it straight up tells you in Dark Souls 1? I do have a theory, but I will need to address that later with some more established context. But first, I want to talk about cleric knights and their purpose. Cleric knights. Clerics who wield weapons. why would there be a need for clerics to wield weapons in the first place? My initial inclination is to lean towards the undead and the undead hunts that are explained with the Lloyd's Talisman. However, I believe that there might have been a reason for them even before the undead came to be. If you remember the magic barrier miracle description, it states there was a short period in history where clerics and sorcerers opposed one another. Thus it became necessary for even simple clerics to have some means of opposing magic. And there's also another item that mirrors that conflict between clerics and sorcerers, the Sacred Bloom Shield, a treasured antique of the Way of White, known to some as Sorcerer's Bane. A conflict between clerics and sorcerers, in my eyes, is the perfect reason for men of cloth, such as the clerics of the Way of White, to take up weapons in opposing magic and to become cleric knights. It would also help explain why clerics always start off with a wooden shield, as they provide a higher level of magic absorption compared to the standard metal shields. The founding of the cleric knights in the Way of White would then facilitate the eventual undead hunts, which took place after Gwyn sacrificed himself to extend the Age of Fire, thus ushering in the undead curse. One thing that sort of rocks the theory that the conflict between sorcerers and clerics happened before the undead curse and the hunts, and before the events of Dark Souls 1 even, is that there is no mention of conflict within the game. There seems to be no ill will between clerics and sorcerers as one may think there would be, but at the same time, if enough time had passed between the war of clerics and sorcerers and the undead curse, or perhaps even Dark Souls 1, any animosity might be forgotten by then. Okay, I feel like that at least sets up a little bit concerning cleric knights and why they may have been formed. But once again, I apologize. I need to set up some more context before everything comes together in what I find to be a quite clear story for the Way of White. I now want to talk about an important figure, Allfather Lloyd. Allfather Lloyd has quite a bit of mention, especially so during Dark Souls 1. His face is even on the currency. But who is Allfather Lloyd? In Dark Souls 1, we get an inkling of who he is from the White Seance Ring, a divine ring entrusted to the head bishop of the Way of White, and apostle to Allfather Lloyd, uncle to Lord Gwyn. The head bishop of the Way of White is the guardian of law and caste, and one of the great royals of Thorlin. From this one description, we get two tidbits of information about Lloyd. One, he is the uncle of Lord Gwyn, and two, it insinuates that Lloyd has quite a bit of standing in the Way of White, being that the head bishop is the apostle to Allfather Lloyd. It does not stop there, however. With the second part of the description, we learn a little bit more about the head bishop when it mentions that he is the guardian of law and caste. I've seen that somewhere else before, items that mention both law and caste. We head back to Dark Souls 3 for some more information, and we get three notable items: the Dual Charm, Lloyd's Sword Ring, and Lloyd's Shield Ring. The Dual Charm says the following: tool used in duels of judgment. Allfather Lloyd's knights lived in fear of his duels of judgment, in which verdicts were carried out by his Sword of Law. Sword of Law. That is interesting. It must have a connection to Lloyd's Sword Ring, which states, ring given to knights of the Way of White. Depicts Allfather Lloyd's Sword of Law. Once again, the Sword of Law is mentioned. Now, all we have is caste. Perhaps if we take a look at Lloyd's Shield Ring, we can get some answers. Once again, it reads, ring given to knights of the Way of White. Depicts Allfather Lloyd's Shield of Caste. So it seems to me that Allfather Lloyd's teachings and values were quite militaristic, being that Lloyd sponsored or even executed duels of judgment, and his symbols were that of a sword and a shield. Quite strange for someone who leads a faith followed by men of cloth. There appears to be a sizable dichotomy between the apparent militant values of Allfather Lloyd and those of the men of faith, who may not desire to wield weapons, as if you remember the Magic Barrier Miracle description, it makes a distinction between clerics and cleric knights. I can very well imagine that these teachings of Allfather Lloyd may dissatisfy some and cause followers to doubt his leadership, especially so after leading the Way of White into battle against the sorcerers for whatever reason. Coincidentally, if we return to Dark Souls 1 and take a look at the cleric's starting robes, this is what they say: robed donned by the men of cloth. Those dissatisfied with church teachings must test their faith by going on a spiritual journey. Such is the ritual of self-purification of the Way of White. Interesting. Those who have doubts about what Allfather Lloyd teaches are essentially banished in hopes that a journey would possibly renew their faith? In my eyes, if anything, that would only cement my thoughts or my feelings and create a sort of disdain towards Allfather Lloyd and his way of light. And if we take a second look at the description, the last sentence mentions that sending doubtful followers on a spiritual journey is the ritual of self-purification of the way of light. This could be read in two different ways. Firstly, in the point of view of the doubtful follower. This journey is the ritual to purify any doubts and restore the previous faith he might have lost due to Lloyd's militaristic teachings. Or, secondly, the route I prefer to believe, it is a method of purification for the way of light itself. These banishments expunge disbelievers and quells people from voicing their own doubts, while at the same time purifying the way of light to only have the most staunch believers remain. I find that this would, as I said before, create a lot of disdain towards Allfather Lloyd. And if we take a deeper look into some other items, we will see that there was a bit of hatred for him, but it solely came from the clerics of Carim. Let's look back at Lloyd's sword ring description, and focus now on the second part. Much time has passed since the worship of Lloyd was common in the way of light. The clerics of Carim had always strongly asserted that Lloyd was a derivative fraud, and that the Allfather title was self-proclaimed. The shield ring says the same thing, and wow, was there a lot of hatred for Lloyd from Carim. Just from that, I would like to take a shot in the dark and say that perhaps the clerics described as dissatisfied with the church teachings from the Holy Robe description may in fact be the same as the Carim clerics. It makes sense to me that those who were dissatisfied with Allfather Lloyd would inevitably be sent on their spiritual journey, which possibly ended in the land of Carim, where they would congregate to make their own semi-denomination of the Way of Light. Everything so far is just a theory, but hold on, we got more things to cover. One other thing that caught my eye was once again the white seance ring description, when it says, the head bishop of the Way of Light. A head bishop, also known as an archbishop, no? So, if an archbishop is, supposedly, at least in Dark Souls 1, the highest rank within the Way of Light, to outright be an apostle of Allfather Lloyd himself, why would we have this description here from the Archdeacon's holy garb from Dark Souls 3? Holy garb, worn by an Archdeacon of the Cathedral of the Deep, a sign of the Way of Light's highest rank. Why would there be a change in name from Dark Souls 1 to 3? Now, once again, the first inclination may be to say that it's simply a translation error. They are one and the same, and in the end, it does not matter. However, I would have to disagree with that sentiment, because in Dark Souls 3, we do have mention of an archbishop. Several, actually. But they're all related to Carim. Irina of Carim, the cleric who teaches you miracles in Dark Souls 3, teaches you both the caressing tears as a baseline and tears of denial if you find and give her the Braille Divine Tome of Carim. Both miracles give you the same description. Miracle taught by Morn, the Archbishop's apostle. This description solidifies the idea that Carim did everything it could to possibly separate itself from the Church of Lloyd by having its own archbishop, apostles, and even goddess in the form of Kytha. But the question is still out there. Why would the highest rank be changed from archbishop to archdeacon? At least in Lothric. If I were to take a guess, I would say that similarly to the Church of Carim's attempts to separate themselves from Lloyd, Lloyd's church did the same when they saw that Carim had its own archbishop, and pretty much tried to outdo the Carim church by saying, you might have an archbishop, but we got archdeacons now. Ooh. There's one more thing that caught my eye concerning Lloyd. Let's return to the Undead Hunter charm description. For a refresher, used long ago by Lloyd's cleric knights on their undead hunts. Although Allfather Lloyd is long forgotten by the Way of Light, his hunts have lived on. This forgotten sentiment is mirrored by both Lloyd's shield and sword rings and the replenishment miracle. Starting with the rings, much time has passed since the worship of Lloyd was common in the Way of Light. And the replenishment miracle says this: miracle once cherished by the cleric knights. Replenishment is a relic of the old Lloyd faith, whose cleric knights were unfaltering in battle. We need to compare these descriptions to the Dark Souls 1 equivalents and see if there's any differences. For the Undead Hunter charm, called Lloyd's Talisman in Dark Souls 1, talisman utilized by Allfather Lloyd's cleric knights to hunt down the undead. In the outside world, the undead are accursed creatures, and Lloyd's cleric knights are widely praised for their undead hunts. The replenishment miracle has a similar tense and connotation. Common miracle amongst cleric knights. Beware of the cleric knight blessed by replenishment, for he shall not fall easily. There are no ring equivalents, but I believe the point has gotten across. There is a huge difference between Dark Souls 1 and 3. In 1, Lloyd and his cleric knights are praised and followed vehemently, while in 3, the Allfather is all but forgotten, and even the talisman has lost its namesake to become a simple undead hunter charm. Lloyd is now a relic of the past and has been wiped away from history. How could such an influential figure in one of the most encompassing faiths within the Dark Souls world be completely erased as he has been jumping from Dark Souls 1 to 3? That is where Sir Arster, Earl of Carim, comes into play. Who is Arster of Carim? What mentions him within the lore? The first item to come to mind was his spear that you can get in Dark Souls 3 by transposing the curse-rotted Greatwood soul. It reads, one of the curses that festered within the belly of the Greatwood, and a terrible weapon favored by Earl Arster the Impaler. The spear is enwreathed in rotten, heavily poisonous meat. The spear is a curse? I've never heard of something like that before. Perhaps we take a look at the Greatwood soul to see if there might be some more information. Ever since its establishment, all manner of curses have managed to seep into the undead settlement. The worst of them were sealed away inside a spirit tree. But eventually, the curses took their toll. Curses, curses, curses. We cannot seem to escape them when discussing Arster the Impaler. Whenever I think of curses, I think of purging stones and the Cursebite ring. How about we head to those descriptions? The purging stone says this: ash-colored stone encasing a skull. Inhabitants of Londor, the land of hollows, use this secret treasure to feign normalcy. Well, that was not very helpful. Maybe the Cursebite ring will be a little more forthcoming with its information. One of the bite rings native to Carim. The crafting of these rings are forbidden, perhaps owing to a fear of malleable stone. Clerics, however, dabble freely in the art. Clerics, Carim? I took a peek at the other rings and they all had the same text. This is quite the find here. The clerics of Carim were the ones who created these rings. Perhaps looking at the Dark Souls 1 equivalents will be of some use for cracking this case. Now that I mentioned Dark Souls 1, the Purging Stones mentions Londor, which we frequent in the game. We need to take a look at them as well. Starting with the Purging Stones, ash-colored stone encasing a skull, same as said in 3. Secret treasure of Arster, the Earl of Carim. Humans are helpless against curses, and can only redirect their influence. The Purging Stone does not dispel curses, but receives them as a surrogate. The stone was once a person or some other being. Oh wow, that is something. We need to take a look at the Cursebite ring now. One of the infamous bite rings commissioned by Sir Arster of Carim. Despite the dreadful rumors surrounding its creation, this ring is an unmistakable asset in its ability to prevent curses. Alright, let's try to take that all in. Sir Arster was the one who asked the clerics of Carim to create the bite rings. That is most likely why in Dark Souls 3 it claims that the clerics dabble freely in the forbidden art of their crafting. It is also safe to say that the Purging Stones were in fact created first, as an experiment almost. Then it developed into the bite rings because if you look closely at the Cursebite and the Fleshbite rings, they both are stones encasing a skull. This leads me to believe that they are in fact Purging Stones themselves. This discovery may have answered a lot of questions and filled in a few holes, but it opens up even more doors now. Firstly, why would Arster need the Purging Stones and the bite rings? I think the answer is pretty straightforward. Arster was going to be around curses. His spear's description says that much, being that the spear itself was deemed a curse. Thus, it led to the Purging Stones, which later evolved into the commissioning of the Cursebite rings. An ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. Finally, this ties us back to the original question that got us on the topic of Arster in the first place. How could Allfather Lloyd disappear like he did? I'm just going to come out and say it. I believe that one of the only ways Allfather Lloyd could have been utterly forgotten as he was would be an all-out war. Someone, somewhere, decided that it was time for Allfather Lloyd and his followers to be taken out. And I'm guessing Sir Arster was the man that did this. With his cursed weapon and a legion of Carim Knights behind him, most likely armed with cursed weapons themselves, Arster ushered in a war between Carim and the kingdoms that bent their knee to Allfather Lloyd. A war between Carim and Lloyd answers quite a few more questions that remained up in the air. From the way I see it, I believe that possibly the Paladins, knights who were trained to use miracles, became a thing because cleric knights were not enough to fend off the Carim Knights. And if you have seen Egon's armor and weapon, you will see why Paladins may have been a necessity. An all-out war could also be substantiated by the Braille Divine Tome of Lothric, as its description reads as such. It is said that no paladin inside Lothric Castle could fall, owing to the divine protection they enjoyed. No paladin inside Lothric Castle could fall. Why would there be a concern about being defeated within Lothric? According to the Lothric Knight Shield, it says that the knights contended with dragons. However, the Knights of Lothric have since tamed dragons, based off the description of the Lightning Urn. And at the same time, none of the miracles taught from the Braille Divine Tome of Lothric were lightning miracles. Nothing to defend themselves from dragons. Therefore, what was the cause for concern of defeat? Two answers I found to be viable. One, the undead, which is boring. Or two, the armies of Carim. Okay everyone, this is it. The theory of mine that is the amalgamation of everything I've found, researched, and read about the Way of White, and how things may have gone down. Now, before I start with my theory, I want to preface this by saying that this is simply a theory. I could very well be wrong about literally everything. This is Dark Souls lore, so it's to be expected. Overall, this will be a demonstration of how I believe events went down. I do not have specific dates or know how long certain events happened, so I will speak relatively in terms of time elapsed. I may also have missed a few events that are widely known, and if I did, I apologize. This is my first go at Dark Souls lore. Lastly, I want to address the theory that Gwendolyn, Gwyn's youngest, is actually Allfather Lloyd. I want to say that it very well may be true, but my timeline here dictates that they were different people, and the White Seance ring is right when it says that Lloyd is Gwyn's uncle, not his son. The first event is cut and dry. Gwyn begins the Age of Fire. Shortly thereafter, people start to worship Gwyn and the race of gods he created with the power of his Lord Soul, thus founding the faith that is the Way of White. Bonfires also appear, and a rite is created by the clerics of his new faith in order to kindle these bonfires so that they can bestow power to the gods they worship. A little bit of time passes before Lloyd, Gwyn's uncle, starts to become possibly jealous of Gwyn's stature among the people and decides to let the people, namely the Way of White, know who he is. From that instant, Lloyd establishes himself as Allfather and heads the Way of White, slowly converting the teachings to be more militaristic and focused on his own worship. Due to the desire of power and stature, Allfather Lloyd begins to spread his own contorted teachings of the Way of White to kingdoms all around the world, starting in Thorland and then moving on to Lothric and the other kingdoms. It then reaches the point where Lloyd's expansion of the Way of White reaches Vinheim, where they attempt to convert the sorcerers there to the faith. However, relying more on intelligence and sorcery rather than faith and miracles, the sorcerers refuse the conversion. Irritated at this notion of disobedience, Allfather Lloyd takes his teachings of the sword and shield to the next level by establishing cleric knights and sending them to war against the blasphemous sorcerers. Conflict. Not something men of cloth are attuned to. Followers begin to doubt the teachings of Allfather Lloyd. These men remember the times where they sought to bring people to the gods and to Gwyn, to heal those who are injured and bring comfort through their stories. However, the moment Lloyd took power and decided he would prefer death and violence over healing and charity, people became dissatisfied with the church's teachings. It is then when Lloyd tells his followers that they must send doubters of the Way of White on a spiritual journey so that their faith may be tested. Allfather Lloyd, with this decree, founded the ritual of self-purification for the Way of White. many who are sent out on this journey find themselves in Carim. Over the years, more and more clerics find themselves there as they are banished from the Way of Light by the All-Father. Eventually, enough congregate to form their own denomination of the Way of Light, the true denomination that went against the teachings of All-Father Lloyd. Soon enough, Sir Arster, the Earl of Carim, is born and raised in that Way of Light, taught to despise Lloyd and his false teachings. The next event is one we all know and love. The Age of Fire begins to fade, and in order to prevent the Age of Dark, the Age of Men, Gwyn sacrifices himself to satiate the flames and extend the age a bit more, while at the same time having the undead curse wrought upon the world. By then, the Rite of Kindling, which according to the item description was a sacred rite passed among clerics, is lost, possibly by Nito's attempt at killing the gods. Did not end up delving too deep into that. Therefore, the idea that it was a sacred rite is solidified. Very shortly after Gwyn's sacrifice, the undead begin to appear, and I believe that is around the time when Lloyd ended the conflict with the sorcerers and made the undead his focus. Let the undead hunts begin. At this point, All-Father Lloyd and his Way of Light was more of an army than a church, and now the grown Sir Arster of Carim, in his hatred, decides to destroy Lloyd and his followers outright, so that the Carim Way of Light may find dominance. In order to execute this daunting task, Arster needs to find a method to destroy the men of Lloyd's faith. It would not be easy, as they are guarded by divine protection. He had to ask himself, of all the injuries divinity protected the faithful from, what could not be abated by prayer? Curse. Knowing that the Carim clerics would be far from willing to take up arms, Arster tells the Church of Carim about his plan to curse the kingdoms of Lloyd into dust. To succeed in this venture, Arster commissioned them not to fight, but to provide the means to purge the curses he and his armies would be enveloped in while fighting Lloyd's faith. With that, Arster promised that the Church of Carim would be given the opportunity to spread their own faith, the true Way of Light, to the world about them while he impaled their enemies upon his spear. The Church obliged his request and developed the Bite Rings. Arster's campaign begins here. Battle after battle, Arster is impaling the men of Lloyd's faith upon his spear, and the All-Father takes notice very quickly. His cleric knights are sufficient at handling sorcerers and undead, but not enough to stave the forces of Carim and its knights. This is when All-Father Lloyd has his own knights trained in the ways of the cleric, to learn miracles that might be effective in fighting the curses used by Arster and his forces. This is when the knights become paladins of the Way of Light. Time passes. War rages on between Arster and Lloyd, and the Lord Souls are becoming weaker by the day. The undead curse is spreading quicker than it ever had before. The Age of Fire is fading once again. It is then when the Way of Light produces its first undead, Paladin Leroy. Upon seeing one of their own paladins resurrected by the accursed dark sign, Lloyd's Way of Light realizes they must do what they can to prolong the Age of Fire, so that a new Lord of Cinder may be found before it's too late. The undead mission is established. Find the Rite of Kindling, which was stolen by Nito many years ago, so that the undead followers of the Way may start kindling bonfires once again, while those who remain alive may fight Carim. A sizable length of time passes after establishing the undead mission. Now many who once followed the Way of Light under Lloyd's faith are now undead themselves, and are set upon this undead mission as well. At this point, the chosen undead escapes the asylum, armed with the mission. Ring the bells of awakening. Once again, another lapse of time passed, beyond that of Dark Souls 1 events. All-Father Lloyd and many of the kingdoms that followed him have fallen. Lothric is the last bastion that is ravaged by the armies of Carim. After all the years of conquest, Arster's campaign ended at Lothric. It is then when his curse of a spear, covered in the rotten, poisonous meat of all those he impaled upon it, is placed within the spirit tree of the undead settlement. Carim clerics, while Arster waged war, wiped away All-Father Lloyd from the faith of the Way of Light, thus replacing him with the teachings of Carim, the true faith that they followed. Eventually, All-Father Lloyd is all but forgotten in the annals of history. Clerics who turn undead who now follow Kareem's teachings, do not go upon the undead mission. The need to kindle bonfires has long been abandoned. Rather, undead heralds who themselves also follow the Way of White are told to seek out undead clerics, bestow upon them their blue robes, and deliver the commandments of duty. Link the Flame. Many try, regardless of their faith, covenant, or class, and most fail, including you. But you are given a second chance, Ashen One. Like many others who failed alongside you, it is your time, Unkindled One. You have your duty, cleric. Link the Flame.